Humans are not secretly teaching oysters how to breathe. And oysters definitely aren't copying our breathing techniques through some hidden evolutionary link or mystical bond. This myth blends a hint of real biology with a lot of imaginative storytelling, but once real science steps in, the whole idea collapses fast. Still, like many poetic urban legends, it survives because the image is beautiful. Humans on the shore, oysters in the water, both breathing together. In this video, we're breaking down where this myth came from and the real science behind why it spread. The myth usually goes like this: because oysters live in tidal zones where they are sometimes exposed to air. They have learned to breathe like humans, and over time they have somehow adopted or mirrored our breathing patterns. In some tellings, people claim that when humans are near oyster beds, our exhaled carbon dioxide or even our slow-breathing rhythms guide how oysters open and close their shells, as if we were giving them a sort of shared breathing lesson. This is often wrapped in language about misunderstood science, ancient coastal cultures, and a kind of mystical shared life force between humans and shellfish. It feels like the kind of hidden history you might hear in an educational video that leans more on emotion than on data. Here's where it gets interesting. Oysters really do have striking rhythmic behaviors that look a lot like breathing from the outside. An oyster spends its life opening and closing its shell, drawing water in and pushing it out, using this flow not only to eat but also to exchange gas, essentially, to breathe in its own way. When conditions change, light, temperature, tides, or water quality, these rhythms shift in ways that can look uncannily deliberate. Some people see a video of oysters gaping open and then tightly closing, and it feels almost like a meditative inhale and exhale. So the imagination fills in the gaps with stories about copied techniques and shared breathing. The evidence people tend to point to usually includes three things. First, oysters can survive out of water for surprisingly long periods by shutting their shells and holding their breath, with a bit of trapped water inside, which sounds eerily similar to breath-holding techniques used by humans in yoga or freediving. Second, oysters open up wide and pump large volumes of water when submerged, which from above looks like long, steady breaths in and out. Third, their opening and closing patterns follow daily and tidal cycles, almost like a built-in cosmic breathing exercise. And in videos, this rhythm can mirror slow human breathing used for relaxation. Put together, this makes for powerful visual storytelling if the scientific explanation is very different. So how do oysters actually breathe in real science terms? Oysters are bivalve mollusks that breathe primarily through gills. Just like fish, using thin filamentous structures with a large surface area to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the surrounding water. Water is drawn across the gills and dissolved oxygen enters the bloodstream, while waste gases leave the body. Some gas exchange can also occur across the mantle surface, which is lined with fine blood vessels. There is no air-filled lung, no diaphragm, and no breathing pattern even remotely similar to the muscular inhale-exhale cycle found in humans and other mammals. Here's the twist almost everyone gets wrong. The dramatic opening and closing of oyster shells is not a conscious breathing technique. It is simply how they manage water flow for both feeding and respiration. Oysters are filter feeders, taking in water laden with microscopic algae and particles across their gills, trapping food in mucus and sending it to the mouth while used water is expelled. When an oyster is gaping, its shell is open to allow maximum water flow. When it closes, it may be resting, protecting itself, or reacting to changes in the environment like low oxygen levels, sediment, or pollutants. Those openings and closings can look like breaths, but they are better understood as valves regulating a continuous flow system than as deliberate inhales and exhales. Now, this is where researchers were stunned. When scientists monitored oyster valve gaping and shell activity over time, they discovered that the rhythms closely followed tidal and day-night cycles, not the presence or absence of nearby humans. Oysters routinely open and close, even when undisturbed and fully submerged. and they exhibit very strict circadian and circadian rhythms coordinated with the positions of the moon and sun. During certain tidal phases, such as neap tides, they stay closed longer. During others, like spring tides, they open more often. This regularity is driven by environmental cues and internal biological clocks, not by watching or copying land-based breathing patterns. The breathing behavior is automatic and tuned to water movement, food availability, and oxygen levels, not our yoga sessions on the beach. This leads to the next surprising truth. Oysters do not even need sophisticated siphons like some other buried bivalves, because many oysters sit on or above the seabed, making direct water flow across the gills easy. Some bivalves that live buried in the sediment have paired siphons, one to draw water in and one to expel, positioned like snorkels up to the surface, which they use for both feeding and respiration. Oysters, by contrast, usually live exposed on reefs or hard surfaces and can simply open their valves to let water cross the gills, which again emphasizes that their breathing is about fluid mechanics and anatomy, not learned technique. In misunderstood science posts, people sometimes claim that oyster respiration rates change dramatically when humans are nearby, implying a kind of synchronized breathing. But controlled experiments show that oyster oxygen consumption and clearance rates depend on factors like water temperature, salinity, food concentration, and pollution, on the breathing habits of human observers. Researchers use things like valve gate monitors and respiration chambers to measure how much oxygen an oyster uses and how much water it filters. And changes in these numbers track environmental stress or food levels, not human meditation or coastal tourism. The data show oysters responding to their habitat, not taking breathing lessons from people. But this is the part most people never hear, even though oysters are not copying us. Humans and oysters really are linked through the invisible chemistry of breathing. Oysters rely on dissolved oxygen in the water, which ultimately comes from photosynthetic organisms like algae and marine plants. While human breath depends on oxygen generated mostly by terrestrial plants and oceanic photosynthesizers. Both our lungs and an oyster's gills participate in the same global oxygen and carbon cycle. We exhale carbon dioxide that can eventually fuel aquatic plant growth, while oysters help clean coastal waters by filtering out mocuting. I have particles and algae shaping ecosystems that, in turn, affect the balance of gases. So, while we are not sharing techniques, we are sharing a planetary breathing system. In educational video terms, the myth that humans share breathing techniques with oysters is a perfect example of how misunderstood history and misunderstood science can turn real science facts into a seductive story. On the surface, the idea of a human-oyster breathing connection feels spiritual and harmonious. But under proper debunking myths work, it reveals a more grounded, yet still inspiring picture. Oysters breathe through gills and mantles, controlled by physics and biology, while their shell movements follow tides and internal clocks rather than our chests rising and falling. The surprising truth is not that oysters are copying us, but that by understanding their real biology, we uncover how deeply all life is tied together through water, oxygen, and time. So, no, humans are not sharing breathing techniques with oysters, but knowing how oysters actually breathe might change how you see both the ocean and your next breath. What myths should I break down next?